Well, it felt like I wanted to do another book group, and Tracks and Traces by Paul Fiddes is this year 20 years since it first came out. 2003 it was first published. Some of you might have come across it not long after that. Some of you might have just discovered it for the first time. I'm pretty sure I got a copy in 2004, and it was the first proper book on Baptist theology that I ever read, and it kind of just grabbed me. And my own feeling is it's perhaps one of the most important, at least in the last 20 or 30 years, books to be written on Baptist theology, seeking to do theology from a Baptist perspective. But I'm not sure, actually, it's had as much engagement with as it should have done. There was a review in the Baptist Quarterly, a very good one by Sean Winter, who is now in Melbourne with some of our Australian friends. But actually, in terms of perhaps it's not been engaged with as much as it should have been. It's not that it's been ignored, it is picked up in footnotes and stuff like that, but perhaps there's more for us to do, and hopefully by reading this book together there'll be some fresh engagement with what Paul is writing in it. Just in case if you wanted to know, Paul knows about this. He's got copies of the books. If you know anyone who wants a copy of the book, he's got loads of them and willing to sell them at a good discount price, and he will probably join us at the end. In terms of the end, when we get to the end of the book. I saw him on Friday and he was kind of, do you want me to be a part? And I said, well, it'd probably be good for us just to talk without you. But actually at some point, as we get to the end of reading Tracks and Traces, it'd be great to have you as part of the conversation. And so he will join us towards the end of the year if you're still on the call or want to come back for that. And he's very happy to then engage with all our questions that we might have for him at that point. So Tracks and Traces, chapter 1, hopefully you've had a chance to read it and engage with it, but if you haven't, this is partly what the summary is trying to do. Paul starts with this, well, again, quickly to say, the book is a collection of essays, which he kind of brings together into a book. And so this first chapter that we're looking at was part of another small booklet that he wrote with English college principals, but it kicks off the beginning of this book with this question of identity. And he starts with this idea of picking up the title of the book, Tracks and Traces. He wants to say the purpose of this book on page 1 is to recall tracks made by Baptists in the past that have the potential still to offer guidance in the present day. That's what he wanted to do. So this is not just theology, he's doing historical theology. If you haven't already gathered it from chapter 1, you'll gather it as you read through the book. He's very much wanting to look at what Baptists have said in the past in that way. The sentence before that I also felt was quite interesting. The group of Christians called Baptists has had some interest in such tracts, but has also shown characteristic impatience with being limited by them. Maybe you recognize that as well, but in the Baptist circles that you're in with. So he starts with this definition of tracts. In many ways, his understanding of, then he starts talking about traces, the second word in the title. Traces he wants to talk about as being pointing to God, and they're a little bit more unfixed. They're more sketchy and ambiguous in that kind of way. And he's wanting to sketch out, he says, some traces of a doctrine of God, traces of a God both disclosed and also hidden. And so the book, in many ways, in this chapter as well, is wanting to look backwards, but also wanting to look forwards in that way. That's the task that Paul sees Baptist theology needs to do. Look back at its tracks, but also engage with its traces. Then he got the first question in this chapter, is there a Baptist way of doing theology? The origins of this chapter came from a book called Baptist Doing Theology, or Baptist Way of Doing Theology. And so he begins with this question, as you might imagine, and he calls upon 3 witnesses in his attempt to answer that question. First of all, he wants to talk about experience of a community, and he draws the work of Frederick Schleiermacher. We have a Schleiermacher, well, if he's not an expert, he's becoming an expert. He's doing his PhD on Schleiermacher, so interesting to hear from Thomas about what he thinks about Paul's use of Schleiermacher here. And he wants to talk about then experience. So a Baptist way of doing theology wants to look to experience. Baptists are those responding to the rule of Christ, he says, whether that's in the congregation, the minister, but also he wants to say extended to the wider associational life. Baptists take the experience of what it is we think the rule of Christ might be saying to the church through the church meeting, through the minister, and wider. But it's also, he says, and it's being able and willing to witness to her sense of being called by Christ. Also, this experience that we have of those called to Christ and responding to Christ is part of the way that we Baptists do theology. And then thirdly, he wants to draw this idea of the freedom to worship. We're not bound by a set liturgy. We may use liturgies, but there's a freedom in worship. And so these different experiences, he says, is something unique to the way that Baptists do theology. Theology is shaped by the experiences. And then he wants to call on his second witness, on Karl Barth, and talk about the confession of a community that Baptists want to look to. Baptists have had a habit and a practice, part of our tracts, who we think God is and what it is to be church. And he wants to say that this is first order, theology first order is the confession of the church. That's what Barth is saying. And Baptists, I guess, are wanting to follow in that sense. Our confessions are important. They're not second order. They're not unimportant or marginal. They're important to who we have been and who we want to say we are. And so Baptist confessions of faith are examples of our proclamation of who we are. The most early confessions of faith were those wanting to say, in the midst of, the middle of the mid-17th century, wanting to articulate that Baptists were not completely odd compared to other Christians, but they were odd in particular ways, especially around ecclesiology, in that kind of sense. And he says that perhaps we need to be more familiar with them as resources for theology, as a theology that's a church dogmatics. Again, picking up Barth there. We do church dogmatics. We start with the congregation in that way. And then his third witness is James McClendon, and he wants to hear, picking up from McClendon's use of stories, especially the idea that of McClendon's idea of this is that the story that we read in Scripture is the story of the church. We are the fulfillment of the church. We are the Pentecost church. We are the Easter church. We are the Good Friday church. And so this story of Scripture, he wants to say, will transform the story of a congregation. We expect when we read Scripture for it to shape our lives, to shape our congregational lives. It will shape our stories of who we are in that way. And so Baptists understand themselves as living immediately in the scriptural story. That's the McClendon idea, living immediately in the scriptural story. Baptists may differ about whether or not this is the central organizing principle for Baptist theology. So McClendon says it is. Others are wanting to say something else. Fiddes himself will want to say, actually, we need to look to covenant as a more central idea, but that's there. But we draw on the narrative life of our community, on hymns, on journals, on stories, as well as our confessions, as well as our experiences. The story of Baptist life shapes the way that we do theology. And there he looks or references particular stories of Thomas Helwys, Roger Williams, John Bunyan, William Knibb, Martin Luther King. Some of those stories, I guess the more well-known, bigger stories that have shaped our Baptist life in that kind of way. And then I think a very important paragraph, he wants to also say that actually we need to pay more attention to the hidden stories of women as well, because those stories should shape the way that we do theology and what we think about God and being church. There he gives the example of Anne Still, the 18th century hymn writer and poet. So that's the second section, how do Baptists do theology? He wants to draw on three witnesses and talk about experience, confession, and stories. And then he asks the next question of the chapter, how can a Baptist community be identified? Which communities are these which give rise to a Baptist way of doing theology? He asks on page 12. And he says that perhaps there is something distinctive about the way that Baptists have held these convictions together. It's not that these convictions aren't held by other Christians, but the way that we've held our convictions together perhaps is distinctive and part of what it is to be Baptist. He wants to say that perhaps one way of talking about Baptist identity, well, is to start not with Baptist with a capital B, drawing again on McClendon, but Baptist with a small b. So start with a set of universals and then work more to the particular. That's McClendon's, he suggests, McClendon's way of doing Baptist theology. Instead, actually, though, he wants to say the better way is to start with the particular. Start with the particular congregation, the particular association, the particular union, and then work up to something broader and what we might say about Baptist identity. And here he talks on page 16, perhaps one of the key sentences in the chapter, about identification rather than identical. Baptists are those who identify with one another. They might not always be identical. Baptists are those who identify with one another because they catch an echo of their story in us in that kind of way. I think that's perhaps something that we might want to talk about. And then thirdly, just as the chapter comes to an end, he says, is there something particularly Baptist about the content of their theology? And here he wants to begin talking about covenant, which will lead us perhaps in many ways. We'll keep coming back to this as we read chapter by chapter, because it's the key Fiddes idea that there is a theological theme that Baptists have right there, one of our tracks, but he also wants to argue that's part of our traces, this idea of covenant. And so if covenant is a theological theme, Baptists should be engaged in a Baptist way of doing theology, or particularly focused on participation in God, the question of how divine grace and human free will are balanced in one another, and then the place of promise within human life in general, doctrine of God, doctrine of salvation, and then how, I guess, a doctrine of mission in one sense there in those particular theological themes working themselves out. That's my attempt to give a summary of the chapter, drawing attention to different bits. So in terms of some questions which perhaps might open up this conversation, first of all, I guess I wanted to ask, do you find the language of tracks and traces helpful, especially this idea of traces? Is that a helpful idea? Did it make sense to you? Secondly, we might ask the question, what do we make of Fiddes' account of the way of Baptists doing theology and its use of experience, confession, and story? Is that something that resonates with us or is found helpful, or might we have some questions of it? And then that key sentence in page 16, which I drew attention to, that identity is more about identification than about being identical. Do you think that's a helpful way of talking about Baptist identity? Those are my three questions. I could have asked a question about covenant, and we may end up talking about covenant, but it seems like we're going to be talking about that a lot, and especially in chapter 2. So I thought we'd go with those three questions, and they're going to be in the chat there if you want to look at them. So what we do now is we have a conversation. And so, you know, if you want to have a go at, or you've got something, again, from your reading of the chapter, or one of those questions spoke to you, or something that's been said, let's have a conversation about what we have. And hopefully we'll get some more engagement, more understanding of this chapter. What did you make of chapter 1? What did you make of the questions that I'm asking? Someone kick us off.
Andy, I thought that was a really good summary of the chapter, which is a good introduction to the book. That was really helpful. I think the concept of tracks and traces is a really useful framework for just thinking about Baptist identity. It draws out themes that are fairly familiar to us, but it packages it in a nice, clear way. Just to sort of add to the questions that might buzz around the whole thing, is that my own reading of the tracks would want to include, I think, a little bit more emphasis on mission. I know that there is the theme of mission in the chapter, and it does come up a number of times, but not quite maybe as strongly as I would have expected. Especially, like I say, thinking about the tracks and the connection between Baptists and evangelicals, for example. I mean, he talks a wee bit about, you know, that we don't have a distinctive theology in the sense that, you know, we subscribe to the creeds, the main creeds, and this kind of thing. So we have connections to others, and particularly to evangelicals. So I just throw that out, yeah, to say, yep, I think this is a really helpful structure. But maybe mission might have been a bit of a stronger emphasis. But
thanks, Ian.
Maybe I can just jump in on that. Thanks, Ian. I think it's a helpful point. And I guess I've been engaging with this book for some while now, and I think for me there are many rich things, and the way that the book has been pulled together from disparate bits of work is a really, I think, important gathering in and of itself. But at the same time, I think that it points to some of the structural weaknesses of if it were to have been a unified volume, I think Paul probably would have worked harder at integrating some of these themes. And I think certainly, however one construes or constructs that which we often call mission, I think it would be one of those, I think, interesting points of integration, and particularly in the light of this focus around Baptist identity that's grounded in Baptist experience in community. And if one were to take in a sort of a step and bring Leslie Newbigin into the conversation, his work around the congregation as the only hermeneutic of the gospel, I think extends what Paul is talking about in this chapter, I think, and takes it into the initial discussion that Paul introduces around the notion of Baptist identity, which I think then becomes a key question that Newbigin, I think, helps us to see, which is about the missional identity of the congregation. Now, whether one agrees or disagrees with Newbigin is another point, I guess, but he certainly extends this move or makes this move. And I think the question around what is the identity of a Baptist congregation as seen in the Baptist experience, how does that relate to this insight that Newbigin brings? I think that would be an interesting point of discussion and exploration if somebody wanted to take this theme up and work with that from Paul's work.
Thanks, Darryl.
I think to throw another question in, it's always interesting to ask, because the Baptist family in the UK, let alone worldwide, is not an homogenous unit that moves together. It's always to ask what makes a Baptist. Is the recognition of tracks and traces that people accept, does that make you a Baptist, or do things that Baptists do shape what being a Baptist is? And I think that it's interesting to see that play out in some of the debates and disputes of whether you appeal to a history and a tradition, or whether people say that's all very well, but this is how we do it now.
Mm. Mm. I guess, yes, the balance between tracks and traces. Which does one dominate the other? Does tracks drive who we are, or the new pressing forward traces and things like that? Does that shape more? Yeah, I think and I guess that's what Paul wants to hold both together in some kind of way. That, you know, Baptists shouldn't be limited by their tracks, but we shouldn't ignore the tracks. And for the historians on the call, you know, perhaps we sometimes feel that the history gets lost or forgotten, or isn't known as much as it should be. But sometimes, I guess, there are others who feel like the history kind of dominates in a way, and we need to be breaking free from it constantly. Yeah.
So related to that, I agree that Paul seems to be trying to hold both of those together. Underneath that key sentence that you identified, Andy, he says it'll lean more on the openness of the trace than the boundaries of a track. And I guess what I'm kind of wrestling with, and I don't know that I have an answer right now, is whether for Baptists those are sort of constraints, or the tracks are constraints or guardrails, especially as we sort of unpack Baptist history. I wonder if, I mean, he does this in a couple of places where he says we don't have these sort of voices in our tradition. So is it really one set of tracks, or is it a multiplicity or a polyvalence of tracks that, not that it doesn't provide guidance, as he talks about in the chapter. It's not to say that and maybe there's something more substantive to that compared to the trace that we might find, and certainly the temporal distinction he's trying to make as well. But that sentence in particular sort of caught me as, wait, is the track a sort of constraining kind of thing, or is there some other role to it? That contrast that he was doing in that sentence, it wasn't to sort of say that one was overly restrictive and one was sort of open to the future, as much as it was, you know, but it made me think a little bit about whether the tracks are as definitive as sometimes we make them out to be, perhaps, or maybe, you know, in that sentence might have been implying.
And I guess for Paul, he wants to say any traces are still going to be a theological engagement. He probably wouldn't be interested in the kind of pragmatic response that, you know, sometimes perhaps the missional response is, you know, that kind of thing. He still wants to, you know, the book, the tracts and the traces are theological, and he would be nervous of the pragmatic there. So, yeah.
But it may be wise to be nervous of the theological as well when you think of, yeah, I would love to find it more compelling in our tradition that the tracks and the traces shape somehow about, you know, the boundary, the identity markers of an actual tradition, rather than this polyvalence of communities. I was left wondering ever such about the small b Baptist, and even for the experience, confession, and particularly the stories. What is there in these traces that help us to choose well the stories? You know, I can imagine you could sit down with 4 or 5 ministers, 4 or 5 churches, theologians, and you'd find it really hard to pick in a Baptist context, perhaps more than in many other contexts, you know, which stories told the Baptist story, which stories really sort of provided those markers. I worked in Italy with an Italian Baptist union, and there the Italian Baptists knew very well what their stories were. There were a few Italian stories, and then there was Martin Luther King, and that was pretty much it. And it may have been a slightly narrower story, but it was incredibly inspiring, and a whole union gathered around something quite important.
I maybe am thinking along the wrong lines, but for me, traces has something to do with seeking God, being open to the kingdom of God, and in community, as Paul goes on to talk about it in covenant life. It's not just, well, we're joined together and we make a physical covenant that we all agree to, and so this binds us together. It's this sense of being bound together in longing for God, and feeling that God has drawn the community together. So maybe I was misreading it, but for me, there's nothing wrong with tracts, but there was this sense in which one must be willing to move out of simply following a track and be open to traces of what God is doing, where God might be leading, how the Spirit might be directing in this community life today.
This is where I found, and it's great to have Mark on the call, Mark Medley. Mark, your, I think it was an article or chapter where you talk about tradition as being something we're stewards of, but we also interrogate and we also improvise. And that, you know, I think that's, it was written after Paul published Tracts and Traces, but it'd be interesting if that was put into conversation. And I wonder if you've got any insights on this.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. Yeah, that was an article that appeared in the journal Pro Ecclesia. I want to say around 2009, 2010. I can't remember the exact date, but I was drawing on a Catholic theologian in particular, actually two, to help give the kind of typology, in a sense, or a way of thinking about tradition being stewardship, in the sense of you are conserving, you are carrying on, but also the notion that we interrogate tradition. We pose questions to it, we bring our suspicion to it, and in that we're not simply merely looking back, but we're also looking forward. And the idea of invention there, invention in the sense of novelty that we may create in continuity with what we have received, but also invention in the sense of also shaving off or dropping off things that are in the tradition that have become perhaps petrified or unuseful. And I think I sort of summed up all those by trying to use the word improvisation as maybe a metaphor for thinking about how all three, and these are all, I understand all these three working together. And I kind of see I think what Paul's doing here with Tracks and Traces is maybe parallel to what I did, or what I did was in parallel to what he was doing. I didn't reference Paul in that article in trying to think about how that works with Tracks and Traces. But I do see, Karen, I really liked how you talked about traces. It is a sense of being open, I think, to what God is doing, and where God is doing things. I think that sort of, to me, the traces also plays into Paul's emphasis and huge amount of work in ecumenism, and listening to other stories, even outside the Baptist tradition. But I think the tracks there are pathways, but I'm not sure how they may be well worn, but they may not be well worn. They may serve as guardrails, but I think there's some elasticity to them. And it's, again, Derek, I think you're right. It's plural. There's lots of different tracks here. And I think part of us listening to our traces, or to the traces, is also looking at perhaps tracks that we're not familiar with in the Baptist world globally. We may be, of those of us on the call, may be more familiar with some tracks than others. And I think maybe there's a part of Paul calling us to pay attention to other tracks we have not attended to. So I don't know if that's helpful or not. I think
that's true. And I think that he goes on, when you were talking about improvisation, when he talks about the cantus firmus, the plain song that is always running underneath, Jesus Christ always under that. I mean, it's changing the metaphor a little bit, but it goes along with this idea that if we think we only have to stay within one particular track, this is the Baptist track and this is what gives us identity, then we may miss the wider sense of what God is doing and where. But we listen always for the cantus firmus, for the plain song of Christ being sung, and that's the guide. And you do that within covenant life, because we call one another back if we go out too far, or we misjudge or misunderstand or whatever.
Is that not part of the problem historically, is looking for the cantus firmus? How do you say to other people you're whistling the wrong tune?
Well, I think, and this will be probably later on in the discussion about covenant life, but presumably one does it within covenant life. And part of, if I just say this and then I'll hush and let other people talk, but if part of the problem of sticking in one rut is that we don't have all the stories. So much of Baptist history has been told as institutional history. And if it's told as institutional history, and we see Baptist as institutional life, we don't have the stories of many people. We only have the main voices. We don't have those who are just learning to sing, or those who make up their own tunes, which are part of Baptist life, but they are interpreting what God is doing within their community, in a particular way, or they sing in a different language, and or from a different culture, and we only understand it from our language and culture.
And that's Paul's point that we need to start with the particular rather than the universal.
Personal.
Gareth, did you want to say something?
Yeah, it was just to agree with that, to that point. If we just follow one track or within one track within boundaries, we lose total sight of the fact that the situation of where we're in at the moment is provisional. It's a moving position. It's not fixed. And we've got to recognize that by looking at the variety of tracks, even from outside, a Baptist tradition, in order to find out where the traces may be going.
And I think Paul would very much, he begins, I think, he is a Catholic theologian, small c Catholic theologian, and that with that emphasis of ecumenism. Tim, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I find the tracks and traces combination very liberating, in as much as I don't think we're following tracks. We can look back and see where the tracks have brought us to this point in time, perhaps from a variety of directions. There are no tracks going forward from where we are. We can see the tradition. Now together, in the light of where we come from, we're trying to find the traces. So it's very much an invitation to explore where we go from here, but in the same direction that we've been following up until this point in time. So I think it's a very powerful combination, looking back and looking forward.
Brian.
Yeah. I just wonder, reading this, I did read it a long time ago and loaned it to another colleague, and it never came back. So I'm reading it again afresh, really afresh. And one of the things that in the conversation so far that I think, as far as the covenant community, the congregations of our Baptist churches, whatever sort of identification they have, when it comes down to saying, how do we identify as Baptists? And we are talking about that with tracks and traces in terms of a theology. But if we go to our church members, our congregations, and we're to ask them how they identify as a Baptist, we're going to get some very, very different approaches to that question. And sometimes I think, is there a difficulty? And I say this after a good many years at the coalface, as it were, of communicating this question of identity without pinning people down. And in the part of this first chapter where Paul is talking about what kind of Baptist, and he looks at some various kinds, and this question, are we Baptists with a big B or a little b? That there doesn't seem to be the need, if you like, of pinning it down too closely. I think we can see in some aspects where probably Baptists have tended to be more to the Calvinistic end of the spectrum, and then there are those who probably move more to the Arminian end of the spectrum. That wide difference. And one thing Paul says towards the end of that chapter was about participation. I suppose there's echoes there of his book, Participation in God. But to participate as widely as possible. And yeah. And I go back to say, if someone says, what sort of Baptist are you? A journey that started 75 years ago, I think. I would say I'm still a little bit of a high church Baptist, because my journey began in a high Anglican church. And because I met a girl who went to a Baptist church, That's how I go to a Baptist church. And just one thing that I think it does speak to this situation. I knew nothing about the background of church history. I didn't know the difference between high and low church. It never entered into it. But when I came back out of the services and started going with my girlfriend to her Baptist church and began to become involved, I wanted to know what made Baptists tick. And I bought a copy of A.C. Underwood's The History of the English Baptists. So I became, and then I read about William, what's his name? William Carey. And I began to become immersed in Baptist history. And I discovered that within about three to 6 months, I think I knew more about the traces of Baptist history than any of the other people in that church who had been brought up as Baptists. That's going back a long time, but I think there are still in some of those tracts, when we think about our identity and what is our theology, it's hard to put a pat answer to that. And I believe I've read on a little bit further that Paul it's about the traces. Yes, the tracts are important. We look back, where have we come from? But I see, and there are bits of it that I've found quite prophetic, really. What he was saying in 2003, we are now beginning to look at those traces. But I mustn't jump too far ahead. But that's my contribution. Yeah.
Brian, thank you for doing an example of what Paul talks about as doing Baptist theology, where sharing some of your experiences, making a confession to us, and sharing your story. And I think that, for me, again, is he wants to say it's about experiences, confessions, and stories. It's not going back to one theologian who governs everything. And it goes back to what Tim was saying. There is this freedom about it. Yeah. Tim, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I've never really read any Paul Fiddes before, but I consider myself a Baptist, a sort of Bonhoefferian, Bartian, Colwellian Baptist. I really enjoyed the introductory chapter. I think a lot of things have been said. I'd agree with. I guess my issue is that I think the whole tracks and traces motif is cute, but it's a bit. It's quite romantic. It's quite idealistic. It's quite utopian. This idea that we can have this well-trodden path that sort of roots us, but there's these little moments where we kind of spot the Spirit at work, taking us somewhere else, and we can all somehow recognize that eventually and get on board. But I think we're in a place where some people think certain things are traces, whereas other people think that's a road to a swamp. And also, what some people consider to be a trace, other people are absolutely convinced that that's a track that we have firmly established and we don't need to go back on. And I was just looking at page 9, the confession of a community. And historically, we've affirmed creeds. Historically, the church has affirmed creeds. And I know a lot of people who identify as a Baptist these days who reject, like, the Nicene Creed, the Apostles' Creed, and also in terms of how we approach the scriptures. I've just heard Baptists say, like, if I don't like a bit of the Bible, I'll just reject it. And I struggle with huge portions of the scriptures. I'm not an inerrancy kind of guy myself. Really want to wrestle with the texts and discern and sense what God is saying, but I will not throw away a part of the Bible because I don't like it. I will do some really hard hermeneutical work, reading widely, open to others, and I just find that interesting, because for me, what I would see as a confession of a community, a historically Baptist community, other people would not see that as a track. They would see that probably as a path that never really existed, but it was like a patriarchal, oppressive, whatever. And I'm pretty liberal, like hands up. But I'm just intrigued as well about that. And I think Paul's trying to basically put a motif in place that holds all of our differences in tension in a way that enables us to think we're all in a community together. I can't see any concreteness to this yet, though I am hopeful I will experience that. Though I do also get a little bit nervous about the page where he quotes Brian Hames, who I'm a massive fan of actually, but he talks about this generous pluralism, and I suppose he's talking about the particularity there, recognizing a wide range of particularities in our experiences, not necessarily pluralism in a religious sense, faith sense, but the particularity, beginning with the particularity. But I just think you have different particularities which cannot be synthesized together in a Hegelian sort of way. They actually clash and they are mutually opposed to one another. And so how we navigate that as a community is really important for us as Baptists, because we can't fall back on a formative theologian to sort of crack the whip and say who's right and wrong. And that's something I'm very interested in, particularly given our climate at the moment. That's something which I think is really important for us to wrestle with. How do we navigate a generous pluralism in a manner which retains the sort of unified whole that we claim and seek, I guess, under the Lordship of Christ? That's my thoughts.
Mm. Thanks, Tim.
Can I jump in and say that on the tracks and traces thing, so what he says on Schleiermacher is generally wrong, like very, very generally wrong. So
love you, Thomas.
And so, but then it still holds the way the movement of the chapter still holds together. Like I think as well, I didn't find him particularly convincing on the way that he said, well, Baptist theologians have always been struggling with the relation between divine grace and human free will. But in the years since he's written this, like a substantial amount of work has been done on freedom in the Reformed tradition. And that he locates the issue within particular Andrew Fuller issue, right? As opposed to like the wider Baptist tradition. He locates this issue between like this tension in one particular historical moment. But then that's just not necessarily how things would have worked in the Reformed tradition before Andrew Fuller. So my thinking is that like he's doing a lot of work with the tracts which don't necessarily have to hold as much weight, but the movement of the chapter still works, even though I think those moments where he's like locating it in historical point isn't working as well as it would have done 20 years ago.
Yeah, I think there is a sense he doesn't need Schleiermacher, Barth, or McClendon. He could have just
that's what I'm trying to get at. Like, as in, I didn't really know what they were doing in the chapter.
Yeah.
As in, if I remove them, but that works for like other examples he's written. Like the chapter still works very well.
Mm.
But and especially as we move forward as Baptists.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thomas, you're basically like a Baptist Schleiermacher.
One and only. Nobody else wants to do that. They're too stupid.
Can I jump in and make a point about pragmatism? Because there's part of me that thinks that if you speak to most Baptist church members or church attenders, that their argument for why they're in a Baptist church is likely to be more of a pragmatic one than anything else, whether it's a discovery of a shared identity or even a shared theological heritage or anything. It's more likely to be, well, that was where the children's work was good, or that was the one nearby. And I have a hunch that if you talk to Baptists who are leaving your church and going to another town, or moving away, if you say to them, so you're going to go to the Baptist church when you get there, first of all, they'll probably say no. That wouldn't be their first thing. So I'm a little bit uncertain as to this question about identification and being identical. I think he's right that we're not identical, and that's quite clear. But this sense of meeting each other and feeling there's something that resonates, or I'm not so sure that Baptists today most people in Baptist churches today would feel that way. I think they've just accidentally ended up in Baptist churches, and for most of them, they don't really know why. And I think that is a change maybe over the last 20, 30 years.
Well, it's like Brian, they met a girl and that's where they landed, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think interesting when Sean Winter, if you read his review of the book, and if you haven't read it, I'm very happy to make it available to you if you're not already a subscriber to the Baptist Quarterly. But Stephen and I would very much encourage you to be a subscriber to the Baptist Quarterly and Karen, as well as
I will take any names, and anyone who would like to be a member, I'll send you all the details.
But Sean's review, one of the things he says is he's worried that this book is far removed from the local experience of our churches. You know, he likes what Paul's writing, but there's a disconnect. And I think, Daryl, you make it in the work that you've done around covenant. You know, we like the idea, but there's a disconnect between what's experienced at the local. So I guess part of me, what do we do then? Do we just say, well, Paul, you know, you're out of touch, or do we actually, is the case is actually we need to pay more attention, which is partly why I want people to read Tracts and Traces, to pay more attention to what Paul's doing here, because it should shape in our local, you know, and not everything that Paul says, but I think the way that he wants to talk about it, which is about, you know, going back to experiences, confessions and stories, that there is something that we've been a part of. There are some tracks that we have followed. Yes, the future is open, but at what point do we leave behind the tracks and then cease to be Baptist? It's a question that I continue to wrestle with. You know, actually, at some point, there should be some recognition to, should there be with the 17th century beginnings, or should there not? And you know, for me, one of the interesting things from reading James McClendon, American Baptist, was that he doesn't really pay any attention to the English 17th century beginnings. You know, he's more in the small b Anabaptist beginnings, which for me was an interesting voice to hear, but it isn't the story of, for those of us who know it, the English and Scottish story, I guess, as well, and Welsh in some ways.
Andy, one of the issues that those of us from Down Under have just been sort of reflecting on as we look at the wonderful faces gathered this morning, afternoon, evening, is the question around the extent to which, as a group, how effectively we represent that global Baptist family. We're predominantly male and all white, which is not necessarily in and of itself a critique or a weakness, but is an observation. And it raises, for me at least, the question around that which those of us, particularly in Melbourne, will be very aware of churches that have gathered and formed here in Melbourne around communities of refugees from places like Myanmar, Chin, Karen, Zomi, for whom the Baptist identity is really core to who they are, really central. It really matters to them, so much so that they do it. They do crazy things to get themselves through theological training so they can be ordained. I mean, what they do, their lifestyle, the choices they make, I think put many of us who have privileged lives down here to shame, to the extent that they seek to do everything they can to identify with the Baptists already in Melbourne, who they see as somehow being part of this worldwide Baptist family. And I think that story is perhaps a story that we often struggle to engage with, where we're working in the world of theology and theological study in the academy. And I think I've become aware since moving to Melbourne that's something I have to deal with and better understand, and take practical steps to understand some of those stories that, for them at least, the tracks are a crucial part of who they believe they are. It's a question in that statement as much as a comment. But I still work with it and wrestle with it.
Do you think that suggests then that the early Baptists, because they were if you like, they came to birth in the UK Baptists, although obviously we're talking about Amsterdam, but the early Baptists, because they were born out of adversity, because they had to identify themselves over and against the other and had to fight for their place. They have more of a sense of who they were, and we don't have to now. It is perhaps that privilege that means we don't think too hard about who we are and what we want and why we're where we are, and therefore don't fight to stay there.
I think the context we inhabit does influence how we think about ourselves. I mean, I find myself in an Anglican theological college in Cambridge, and Cambridge still reflects its Anglican inheritance. And being a Baptist in an Anglican theological college, to some extent, sharpens my sense of identity. In that, I resonate with McClendon because he started on his journey towards his systematic theology because he found himself as a Baptist in an Episcopal school in the United States of America. So if you inhabit an ecclesial context with the attendant theology that goes with that, and you're different to that, it can sharpen your sense of identity. But that's not the only context that can sharpen identity. I think Darryl has alluded to another. If you're an ethnic community in a new environment, a sense of ecclesial identity and the theological values that go with that can be more heightened. And Ashley pointed us to the historical origins of the Baptist movement in the 17th century, where to be a dissenter very much heightened a sense of difference. So I don't think we can ignore the fact that if you inhabit a different kind of context, that can have a big influence on how you see yourself, how you define yourself, and who you choose to identify with. I suspect this theme will continue to emerge as we go through the book.
Mm. Yeah. Brian.
Just to come back a moment, on that basis, I found myself in the last 5 years of my active ministry, which is quite a long time ago now, as an authorised Methodist minister, because I was working in what became in Leicester here, a bit of a flagship LEP. That was when Clarendon Park Baptist Church came together with Clarendon Park Methodist Church, and we became Christ Church. And I remember when I was having to apply to become an authorised Methodist minister, I had to get permission from Malcolm Goodspeed, who was head of ministry then. And I think I still have the letter in which Malcolm said, I wonder how we treat the word, or words to this effect, the word authorised, in terms of me becoming an authorised Methodist minister in order to be able to minister in this LEP. And I felt then I had to really give some attention to my own identity as the Baptist minister in that situation. And I found there were times when I was reminding my Methodist colleague, whose theology was somewhat different to mine, but really coming back almost to pragmatism, reminding him that there were some slight differences between us, but we did work together very well. But that's where, coming back to what Paul was saying about, participating as widely as we can, and at the same time retaining those, if you like, distinctives that are important, but not allowing some of the other distinctives to get in the way of a thoroughgoing Christian ministry. And that for me was one of the if you like, one of the issues that I had to deal with in that situation, but it worked, and it's still going on now, and that's going 20, nearly 30 years later. But
it will be interesting to hear from our friends in America and Australia who don't have this same kind of background of persecution and identification with the minorities and legally discriminated against, whether that has produced the same sort of issues in the churches that they have.
Stephen, I'll just say this, and also in response to Brian and to Julian, just as an example, I think of Baptist in the American South, it's not a question of sharpening identity, it's been a question of dulling identity, where Baptist churches are on every corner, Methodist as well to a large extent, but the dulling of identity, I think, has been the trajectory for some time. Maybe one example of that, and Derek, you might want to jump in here too. Even in the late 70s, early 80s, there was questions among Southern Baptists about, are Southern Baptists evangelical or not? Now there was a whole conversation about what does the term evangelical mean, but it was a sense of are Southern Baptist or are they something else? And trying to think about this term evangelical. So I think in a sense of where in at least in the southern states of the United States, where Baptists are so prominent, it's really dulled identity, and in that case, a lot of Baptist folks who are in the pews may not understand or think at all about what it is to be a Baptist. They're more easily would identify themselves as evangelical, perhaps. So,
and that was true in my experience of being in Australia. Actually, I think in many ways, in Australians, you jump in here in a minute, but I think it's also true, or increasingly become true, in the UK as well, of this relationship between Baptist and evangelical, which Paul doesn't really engage with at all, and it's not a conversation that he has, I think, at any point really in the book, or that he's had anywhere really. But it does seem to be the pressing question, and it picks up. Steve Holmes in his book Baptist Theology talks about a minimalist or a maximalist understanding of being Baptist. A minimalist is basically an evangelical who practices believers' baptism, and then a maximalist is one with a much stronger ecclesiology. And it seems that majority of Baptists in our churches, at least in the Western world, are minimalist in terms of, we're evangelicals who do believers' baptism.
Andy, I would follow up and say, in the wake, I come out of a Southern Baptist background, and in the denominational conflict that led in part to some leaving and creating what is now the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, there was a moment when the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship was birthed that there was some questions and conversation going on about identity. So, and there's a sense in which, out of conflict, a group that in a sense lost in the institutional war, and then moved away, questions of identity surfaced and were wrestled with. I think to a certain degree, some of that was sort of didn't last very long, but Derek and I are sort of a part of a group of Baptist thinkers in the States who have kind of kept those questions, or at least try to keep those questions going, and thinking about what does it mean to be Baptist and thinking about identity. Derek, you might want to jump in here.
Yeah, so what came to mind right at the end there, Mark, was the ways in which the tribe of the sort of denomination, I guess you could say, or I guess that's what it calls itself now, that was birthed out of that Southern Baptist controversy, actually had a hard time distinguishing, I would say, and using Paul's terms, between identification and being identical.
Yeah.
They had a really hard time. So the whole project just got sort of set to the back burner.
Yeah.
But there was so identity questions were just largely just ignored. And that became, I think, the other kind of challenge that I think perhaps makes Paul's argument helpful, even if it is somewhat dated at this point, that the importance of asking such questions that could be useful for even folks that are in those situations. But yeah, it is a sense that it was there was some struggle, and in some ways still is. I think the way they would describe it would be, it's not that bad theology led to this split as much as just theology.
Yeah.
That was some of the language that you would hear from time to time.
Yeah.
I wonder if Carolyn or Andy might jump in.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. It's been a fascinating conversation. I personally have found this language of tracks and traces very helpful in holding together some of the tensions that I see and experience in trying to teach this area of Baptist identity and history to students. But what I find amongst my students, certainly with the Anglo students, there's a deep skepticism about attending to traces or tracks of any kind that are not directly the words of scripture. There's a skepticism that this is not going to lead us astray in some way. And then they're in the classroom in conversation with these students from other places, often Myanmar, for whom their entire identity as refugees is on the basis of having been identified as Baptist, and this being such a strong set of traces that it's actually led to them leaving the place from which they come. So in the one room, we have these two almost contradictory approaches to being Baptist. One, which is a strong identification with this set of tracks from a past time, and another which is almost relentlessly obsessed with present day or future revelation and experience as the basis for what they're interested in. So I'm holding this tension together, and this is part of what makes this conversation so interesting to me, to find a way to have a conversation that includes both those groups of students, as well as these wonderful theologians like Paul Fiddes. And I am keen to learn from others about how we might go about doing that, because it's challenging.
Yeah, I've been thinking similar things to you, Carolyn. I think, you know, I've spent a lot of time in Yindamu and Ali Karang Baptist churches, which are right in the centre of Australia, and they are exclusively Aboriginal Australian Baptist churches. And trying to think of, if Paul Fiddes was sitting there and talking to them about their tracks and traces, they would be pointing to the work of God in their culture, I think, not in the ecclesiology of the Baptist Church, although there's lots that they would value about the ecclesiology of the Baptist Church, and there's a reason that they are Baptist and not anything else. They're one of the most evangelized groups of people in the world, so they could have had their pick of just about any denomination they wanted, and they stayed with us. But I think what you said about tension, Carolyn, is kind of where I've gone. Like when I came to faith in a Baptist church, I was 19. I'd moved from New Zealand to Australia. And the thing that appealed about the community was their willingness to hold in tension a number of different theological perspectives and beliefs, because we gathered around the person of Christ, and that was more important than, you know, our diverse views on marriage or gender or sexuality or whatever the issue was. And I wonder if I'm writing my PhD at the moment on the theologies of relationship and this idea of covenant, and is there a distinctly Baptist way of being in relationship with each other? And I think there is, and I think our capacity to hold difference and tension, to my mind at least, is what makes us Baptist, or one of the things that makes us Baptist. And when we begin to lose the ability to do that, which I think some of us are talking about, this kind of strongly evangelical perspective, or more political perspective perhaps, I think begins to be divisive. And we here in Australia, we're beginning to see churches wanting to push for very sort of how would you put it, Carolyn, like wanting to say that secondary theological issues now need to become the identifier for being a part of the Baptist Union, when that's not necessarily been the case historically. And certainly in our Burmese communities, where there's 1.4 million Baptist people, way more than in the UK or Australia or New Zealand, or when you go to the Central Desert or to the Māori Baptist communities in New Zealand, like, I think those communities understand better what it means to hold things in tension, because that's been their experience, where I don't think our people, in terms of white Australians at least, need to do that anymore.
Thank you, Andy. Julian, we're going to come to a close very soon. Julian.
I mean, I think it's worth bearing in mind that Paul has done most of his theology in Oxford, which is a very Anglican environment, and he's also been involved throughout his work and ministry in a lot of ecumenical conversations, which does leave its imprimatur, I think, on his perspective. But it's perhaps worth bearing in mind that Tracks and Traces is published against the backdrop in the 90s when there are some powerful alternative voices in British Baptist life. So you've got people like Rob Warner at the more popular end, and Nigel Wright, who are very much advocating that to be Baptist is essentially to be evangelical. And so there is that discussion going on. It's not absent, but there are different streams, I think, engaging with that, with identity, but from slightly different perspectives.
It's getting to 1:15, which I feel we need to draw it to close. I'm sure we could keep talking, and if you want to stick with reading this book together, I'm sure we will come back and continue talking, come back to lots of the same issues, and hopefully finding new insights and new perspectives. Thank you everyone for your participation on this first occasion. We come back chapter 2 in a month's time, which is looking at Paul's idea of covenant, recovering it historically, but also seeing it theologically. So it's both a track and a trace, I think, for him in that kind of way. And I hope you will be able to join us then.